perfectly fine. Feel free. On December 14th, 2012, in Newtown, Connecticut, a 20-year-old, Adam Lanza, fatally shot 20 children and 6 adults. Since the shooting in Sandy Hook Elementary School, 74 fatal shootings in schools have occurred. Just this past Sunday, June 9th, 2 Las Vegas police officers, both fathers, sat down to eat lunch at a pizza restaurant. Jared Miller walked in and shot officers Igor Saldo and Alan Beck, and yelled, "This is a revolution." They covered the officers with a coiled snake above the words, "Don't tread on me." Every year, more than 31,000 Americans die by gunfire. The numbers are staggering. Tom Diaz, who I met on a trip to Washington, D.C., is a former policy advisor of the Violence Policy Center and a U.S. House Judiciary Committee specialist on terrorism and firearms. And he speaks as a prophet on how the greed of the arms industry is dealing death daily. He writes, "In the 4 decades between 1969 and 2009, a total of 5,586 people were killed in terrorist attacks in the U.S. By comparison, 30,000 people are killed by guns every single year, more or less between 1986 and 2010. Why is there a war on terrorism and not a war on gun violence?" Recently, in a blog, Tom wrote these words: "I am sick of these self-righteous, self-justifying, gun-obsessed people. I am sick of their pathetic twaddle and the relentless facts that they spew in making America increasingly absurd. But I'm mostly and most deeply feverishly sick of all other Americans, all the non-combatants, who vastly outnumber the gun nuts, but who only whine and wring their hands and still won't and don't do one damn thing about it until the specter of gun violence touches them. They ask questions that have been here for decades with stunningly obvious answers. Will it end? What can we do? What should we do? I am sick of you," he writes. In his book he recently published, he delineates a number of policies and clear directions in regard to the challenges of gun violence. He claims that there's a deliberate suppression of data in regard to the public health consequences of firearms in the U.S., a failure of the media to report it, a failure of the public to address the aggressive hyper-marketing of weapons in the gun industry, and a militarization of the civilian gun market, and an indifference, finally, of the policymakers who could lead on gun control. Tom Diaz speaks as a prophet, and indeed, in moments of this sort, we actually need prophets to speak. The question that one could ask is prophetic language effective? And it's actually interesting to note how ineffective often prophetic language is. At least in most circumstances. What comes to mind in a similar but actually interestingly challenging vein is a journalist in 1903, Chaim Nachman Bialik, who went to Kishinev following a pogrom. He was repulsed by the brutality and the destruction, but even more by the passivity of the people, the refusal to fight back. He decided to write a poem entitled "The City of Slaughter," which changed the course of Jewish history. The shocking description of the passivity of the menfolk to the rape of their wives and daughters unleashed a sense of moral outrage that became a profound motivation to many young men. This portrayal of outrage, and interestingly, we'll come back to the City of Slaughter, is rarely effective in doing more than motivating passion. But it does not actually generate discourse. It generates a sense of urgency. It may motivate populations to address problems, but it does not actually give anybody sufficient tools with which to address them. The challenge of the Jewish community on an issue of this sort is a challenge of coming up with the proper frame for actually addressing the public discourse. And there are two failures of the Jewish community in this regard. The first is that while we've had a policy, and we've had one for some time, the policy actually has had very little impact on the discourse in America. And the second thing is that the policymakers are themselves not fully engaged with the deeper questions of what guns mean in America to ordinary Americans. Sid Schwartz, in his book on Jewish politics, suggests that there are two impulses in Jewish politics. One is a Sinai impulse, and the other is an Exodus impulse. The Exodus impulse is what's important for the Jewish polity and for our own assured survival. The Exodus motive is the motive to send people to Congress to lobby for the security of the state of Israel. He claims that there's a Sinai motive as well, in which Jews actually care about larger issues, the issues of covenant or justice. And those issues side by side actually often affect the way Jews engage politically with a challenge. He tells a story about Marshall Berger in the White House, the liaison to the Jewish community during the Reagan era. He invites leaders of the Jewish community to come in and talk to the administration's representative. And according to him, the Jewish community leaders spoke about ADFC, the program that was designed to help dependent families with dependent children in concerns around poverty. The fact that Jewish organizational representatives spent precious time talking about an issue that related to low-income families, and not specifically around Jewish interests, but around Jewish values, disturbed Breger. While there are issues in the communal agenda that are actually full of contentious debate, what's really interesting about gun control is that there's very little organized Jewish resistance to active commitment to gun control. That's why I would say the title of this session was a little, I think, not quite on target, because the consensus building in the American Jewish community is actually not so needed. The JCPA in 2007 and recently 2013 put out very clear policy directives around the concerns of gun control. No doubt, in San Francisco, the attitudes were actually more liberal than the JCPA materials. And all the edits that come from San Francisco are edits toward greater, more liberal reading of the position. No doubt, you go to Dallas, and you're going to find a much more conservative concern around that document, and edits in that direction. And I have at the end of your materials, you can watch the different communities struggling to add or to subtract various elements of the general commitment to gun control. Whether it's called gun control, or whether it's called response to gun violence, whether it addresses mental health issues broadly, or whether it focuses very specifically on guns. These questions, to some extent, are actually somewhat paltry. The real issue is that the American Jewish community, in terms of nearly every JCRC, has formally been willing to be part of this discourse, and while in many communities there's a resistance to act upon it locally and to publicly ally with it, nationally it appears everybody does. So why do the local organizations not jump on the bandwagon in a number of places across the country? Mostly because they don't find it an effective way to engage with the problem. They don't feel the Jewish voice on this issue has any salience. They feel that they may lose traction on other issues. In Dallas, I was told, among the challenges are that the community was struggling with Christian organizations that wanted to support BDS. And they believed that if they would take a position against gun control, or for gun control, that they might undermine other efforts that they were concerned with. In other words, the challenge of addressing this issue is not a challenge of conviction, but a challenge of priority making and a challenge of efficacy, and a deeper question about how much Jews could affect the American discourse around the Second Amendment issues and around the deep psychological love affair that Americans have with guns. I want to kind of address the question in a bit of a different way, because while the politics of this are being worked out, and in fact, in Boston, as a great example, the Jewish community is really powerfully behind gun control, and it is to its benefit because it can ally with many local organizations that are against it. So, in other words, part of the challenge is, where do Jews see an alliance of their Exodus and Sinai values, and where do they not? And when there's not an alliance between the Exodus and Sinai values, when it appears that the values issues are on one side and the self-interest issues of the Jewish community on another, how do they navigate? When do they take principle over self-interest and when not, right? The American love affair with guns is actually quite old. And I don't think we fully understand it, or at least not publicly. And so what I would like to do is actually claim that there is an opportunity for us to move away from the prophetic model, which rabbis all over the country have been using to shout out against gun violence, and explore a little more deeply our own inner conflicts around guns and violence. Because unless we can enter the discourse not as prophets, but as rabbis, you might say, as people curious about the opposition and not merely outraged, unless we can enter into that discourse, we will have very little access for doing more than screaming. And for many Jewish communities, yelling in the public space is simply costly politically and not effective. So in order to enter into this discourse, what I want to do is think about what we can contribute that is uniquely Jewish, that is ours to contribute, and will actually begin to further the American conversation around guns. Days after Newtown, Rabbi Menachem Creditor asked me to join him to go to Washington with a coalition of clergy to speak to the government, to the Congress, on gun control. They believed that the moment was ripe. They were wrong. It wasn't ripe enough. But I agreed to go with more curiosity at the time than passion, to be honest. And I went to bed that night trying to kind of drum up all my feelings and thoughts about guns and Jews. I want to ask you to do the same. I want to think about, what do Jews feel about guns? What is it actually? Does it, we see a gun on the table, what do Jews feel about guns? And the complexity actually is bigger than you might think. So here's what came to my mind. I'm open to exploring it with you, and then we have some texts, I think, that will tease out more of this Jewish material around violence and guns that will, I think, enrich our voice, if not prophetically, though potentially too, at very least in the Beit Midrash frame of understanding what might be the opposition. What came to mind was my grandfather. My grandfather was an Odessan Jew living in Paris in the 40s. My mother and aunt were wakened in the middle of the night. It was 1942. Armed French soldiers came and took my grandfather out of his bed to Drancy. 2 months later, he was transported from Drancy to Auschwitz and there gassed. My grandfather did not own a gun. The people that took him were armed. I remember a hooligan family in my childhood that lived outside of town, and they were Jews, and my mother knew the mother of these young boys and their father, a wealthy podiatrist, had kind of hung around a group of ne'er-do-wells and got involved with guns. And we knew that there was this Jewish family who was excited about shooting things up. My father once went to the shooting range with him. And I remember feeling like this wasn't a Jewish family, really. We had humane ways of killing our meat. No shooting deadly weapons for sport, I thought. Esau hunted venison. Jacob cooked lamb stew in a tent. But my father, in 1968, bought a firearm after the Six-Day War. He claims to have done this out of a mix of family security and Jewish pride. My father and many others said never again to the Holocaust, and it was given. They got a fresh sensibility of excitement about their vitality and about Jewish vitality that liberated Jerusalem in the Six-Day War, and buying a gun was a way to join that Jewish resurgence. Uncle Ron, my mother and my aunt survived the war. Uncle Ron, Aunt Gloria's husband, bought a gun, and when I called him up before going to Washington, he said, "I have a gun, because this time I'm not going quietly." I remember a young Israeli student named Kobe who issued me a gun when I was learning at the Gush. I had had very little training. Americans were trained for one day and were given guard duty to walk the perimeter of Gush Etzion sporting an AK-47. It made me feel very proud, very manly to walk around the yeshuv with the gun slung over my shoulders. I even actually once took it out of the machsan like you would take a book out of the library and walked alone among the Arab villages on a hike by myself. An AK-47 that I barely knew how to shoot, slung across my shoulder. I'm embarrassed by that photograph that I still keep. I was proud to be included in the security detail, but I have to say, while sporting an AK-47 made me feel powerful, it never made me feel safe. I remembered one other story that I had heard about as a child. A guy named Moshe Speart, who was a gun runner. Actually, really, he just was, a retired, businessman. And he decided in 1947 to be a gun runner and to ask all the American Jews who came back from the war with guns in their possession to hand them over and get them to the Israeli forces attempting to defend themselves in Palestine. Guns then meant life. And lastly, the person that came to my mind was my cousin Tzvi. My cousin Tzvi is actually my partner's cousin, a non-ideological Jewish settler. He was living in a very affordable area, driving back with his mother and father and son who had just gotten married the night before. A sniper shot at the car, instantly killed him, and wounded my partner's uncle and aunt. The irony is that this man lived in the Shtachim and owned a gun, but hardly was that gun capable of protecting him. I raise these stories in order to share the complexity around which Jews actually think about guns and about weapons and about self-defense. And what I want to do is actually, instead of coming up with outrage or even with clear policy, first begin to understand what guns historically mean to us deeply, both intellectually and psychologically. So I'm going to take, 2 minutes, 5 minutes out of the discourse. What do guns mean to you? Yeah. What's your name?
My parents wouldn't show us, so guns are anathema to me. But I also have to say I went to a commemoration a couple of years ago that horrified me because they had a large slideshow of Jews during the Holocaust with guns, and that's all they showed. And
Right.
They didn't talk about spiritual resistance.
Right. There was an embarrassment after the Holocaust, similar to Bialik's embarrassment, that somehow the real villains in Kishinev were the men who watched their wives being raped and did nothing. And that better to die trying to protect your wife and child, and that somehow in that picture, guns play a role. You should know that there is a Jewish organization called Jews for the Preservation of Firearms. And on the site, repeatedly, are Holocaust metaphors and frames of reference. Right? Exactly. So there's this sense that the Holocaust could motivate, by the way, Sinai and Exodus could motivate Jews focusing on Jewish survival, could motivate Jews focusing on social justice, could motivate Jews to eschew weapons and violence, could motivate Jews to JDL self-preservation. I just was speaking to Naomi Seiban, who was teaching here, and she told me a story that she once bumped into a JDL march, and she heard them say, "Every Jew a 22." And that line, I heard also today from Yehuda Mirsky, Leon Wieseltier gave them that line when he had a very short stint with JDL. In other words, there's some deep sense in which guns serve for some people in certain circumstances as a kind of protest to a trauma or a shoring up of failed masculinity. Now, we know all this, except that we somehow feel that it's not so Jewish. But indeed, what I want to get close to is, where are the sensibilities, both inside our memory and inside the material, to help us dig more deeply and thoughtfully into the challenge facing America, the deep, dark challenge around security and fear and guns and self-preservation and independence, all that stuff. What else do you think about guns?
So I have a personal experience with guns. I had the opportunity to serve in the military here in the United States, and I went to the war and I had to use a gun. And I think most of my Jewish American friends who love guns and own guns, and I grew up in Russia, so it's a whole other conversation. But they don't understand the power of guns. They never used guns, and once you have that experience,
you actually shoot a gun at a person.
You actually shoot a gun at a person. It disarms you. It makes you a person who becomes, like you said, much less safe with a gun, and makes you understand what it means to have a gun and how it makes you much less secure.
So that's part of the complication, is that the gun comes to secure you, but it actually deepens a sense of insecurity, right? It's an interesting kind of paradox in a way. There's also, my partner works in the theater, and he said every play in which you see a gun in the first act, know it will go off. There is something about a gun that always invites its use. And in a certain sense, it emotionally is begging to be fired. And there's this sense that it I think we have this kind of both the powerful frame of that, but also the terrifying frame.
And just one more.
Please.
That even if God forbid, you have to use a gun to protect yourself and defend yourself, and you use it lethally, that lives with you for the rest of your life, that you can't live with, and it's not a positive experience.
Right.
It may be positive. So even though the Holocaust is played towards our, feeling that every Jew is 22, these people don't live with murder.
That's right.
If you want to die nobly, carry a gun. If you'd like to live, there are other strategies. And owning a gun is a very short-term strategy. That's what you can do at the last moment of desperation. But there are other things you can do before that.
It's also a question of exactly what the nobility is, and I think we're going to talk about that in a second. But, my uncle and aunt both have a gun by their bedside. And I always find it challenging. I say to them, in the middle of the night,
How old are they?
in their 70s, in the middle of the night, someone actually comes in to steal something in your house, and you feel that in the dark, fiddling for the pistol, that you will be better than them at shooting and at nabbing them, and that instead your fantasized heroics will actually kill you. It's well known that while the complexity of this statistic, I think, should be admitted, owning a gun makes you 3 times more likely to die by gun violence. Right? But nonetheless, even after that fact is known, there are plenty of people for whom owning a gun still makes them feel more secure. I want to actually dive into some of the texts that I've gathered, but what I'm trying to do is educate our discourse so that we have more to do than sound like Jeremiah. Angry at the miscarriage of justice, angry at the failure of leadership, angry at the carnage that's happening in our streets. We need more than that in order to solve this problem. Take a look at Genesis 14. So Lot is captured. Lot is captured by 4 and 5 kings who are waging a battle with each other, and one of them attacks the king of Sodom, and Lot is there in Sodom, and so he is confiscated along with all his stuff, and an escapee reaches Abram, the Hebrew, and he was living with Amorites, Mamre and Eshcol and Aner, and they confederate with Abraham. And so Abraham basically pursues these kings and succeeds in defeating them and releasing Lot from captivity. And after this occurs, first thing, the one thing I want to say is that if you take a look at the Yudalid, Vayishma Avraham, and Abraham heard Ki nishbachi, that his brother, his kinsman, was captured. Vayarek et chanichav. Vayarek et chanichav is often translated as he led forth or poured out his men from rake. He emptied them out. But vayarek is also used as in a context of army. Arik charbi means I will empty my sword, but it's actually used as a kind of language of armament. So this would be the first time you could say in the Hebrew Bible, we have a scenario in which a Jew gains arms in order to solve a problem of violence perpetrated by somebody else and wants to defend his own. This would be a kind of stand your ground frame for defending the people who you care about. It's the cowboy version of what guns are for. They are for you to protect your family and friends from violence from others. And Abraham does this. What's interesting about this text is that as soon as he succeeds, he refuses to take any booty from the war, but moreover, according to Chazal, the rabbis who read this text in 15, he's afraid that having killed in a war of this sort, he has lost the covenantal promises that were given to him. He is fearful. What's her name in the corner? Ilya? Ilya is right. The use of that kind of weaponry, even in justified circumstances, leaves one feeling morally deficient, and he's afraid that he has lost God's covenantal love. And he is told, no, don't worry, fear not, your reward shall be great. But that interesting challenge, like the sense that a legitimate use of weapons still feels guilt-ridden. Why? Because on some level, there's no pleasure in actually taking out the kings that are capturing his kinsmen. He actually feels morally challenged by having to do it. Take a look at Exodus 22. We're going to move more quickly because I want to accomplish a few at the end. Another scenario that is really similar to the scenario my aunt and uncle and lots of other people think. There are bad people out there with guns, and they are going to come into my house and try to get me or something. And so if someone comes into the house tunneling in to thieve, to take, right, then he has no blood guilt. There's no blood guilt if you kill him. Yeah? It says, ein lo damim. He has no blood, meaning the moment a person enters your house to steal secretly, he knows that if you stand up to him, then you might kill him. Therefore, he will kill you first. You have the right to kill him. In other words, you don't have to wait for him to show lethal force. If the moment someone's breaking into your home, you can shoot, right? And ein lo damim means while it's still, a horrible thing to have to do, there's no blood guilt because you would assume that someone breaking into your house is going to be willing to kill you. You can kill them first. And from this text, the Talmud learns that someone who comes after you to kill you, you're allowed to kill him first. Take a look at Rashi on the text. So let me just see. It starts here. Look at source 5. Someone please read. Tunneling.
Tunneling, that he was digging into the house. He has no blood. This is not murder, since he is already as if dead. From here the Torah teaches you, if he comes to kill you, kill him first. This burglar comes to kill you since he knows that no one restrains himself or remains silent when he sees that a person is taking his property. Therefore he comes knowing that if the owner confronts him, that he will kill him.
Right.
Shall I go on?
No, yeah, go on.
If the sun rises upon him, this is a metaphor. If it is clear to you, like the peaceful sun that shines upon the whole world, that the fellow is peaceful with you, and so obvious to you that he does not come to kill you, then even if the owner stands up to him, you would not be willing to kill him like a father who breaks in to steal money from his son. But since he surely has a parent's love for a child, he does not come ready to kill him. He has blood, he is considered alive, and so it is murder if the householder kills him.
So imagine the scenario. There are two scenarios. Someone you don't know tunneling in, you can kill him. But if there's someone who's coming into your house that you know, for whatever reason, is willing to steal, but emotionally you don't expect him to kill you, then you have no right to kill him. In other words, it's only an assumption you have that you're going to assume that someone's kind of ready to kill you, that you can kill them first. But if you would not assume that they would kill you, you can't kill them first. So what's interesting about this?
Are your assumptions valid?
In the middle of the night, you're trying to figure out, is this a person who could kill you, who would kill you, or who wouldn't kill you? A. B.
South Africa.
Right. And then what else is going on here? Is that you don't know who's tunneling into your house. It could be who?
The gas station.
Or your kid. Or your father. And you don't even know what the motive is. Maybe he's coming to steal. Maybe he's not. In other words, on some level, here's a perfect scenario in which many gun accidents occur in which the perpetrator responds with stand your ground, and all of a sudden what they recognize is they've killed someone they know or love. Because in the moment of trying to discern, is this a person attacking me, not attacking me, willing to kill me, not willing to kill me, the moment stand your ground is framed as the rationale for action. You end up with
somebody with a bag of Skittles in their pocket.
That's right. That's right. So what's interesting to me is not only the fact that the texts are addressing the struggle to figure out how I protect myself, but they're recognizing that the attempt to self-protection may actually be met with a misconstrued reality all the time. In other words, what's really being portrayed here is I have the reasonable right to fear that someone coming at me could hurt me. But that reasonable right will easily be misconstrued. And ultimately, I may end up actually being guilty of murder for someone that I actually know or love and didn't understand what they were up to, which is a huge portion of the gun violence. Not to mention, of course, the gun deaths, not to mention, of course, that a significant portion of gun death has to do with suicide and has to do with accidental death, with kids playing with guns or people not knowing how to use guns. I want to turn to the next text that actually opens up that discourse. So please turn to, let's see. Yes, text 9. Please turn to text 9 and someone please read.
You're talking the little one above a comma?
Yeah, please, yes.
What page?
It's on
Page
page
three.
3.
Number 9.
One cannot sell to idolaters, bears, lions, or anything that can do harm to the public.
There's a text that I thought I included that doesn't seem to be here, is a text that also prohibits keeping a shaky ladder in your home. You're not allowed to possess things that by accident can cause damage. And therefore, you have to actually own a home that does not include in it unrealistic, dangers that people not knowing might actually be harmed by. And we're not allowed to sell things to people that we don't trust. So, for example, we can't sell armaments to idolaters and Kuthites in text 11. And not only the reason idolaters and Kuthites is because they simply weren't trusted not to be violent with them. And therefore, it was like selling arms to a criminal. And indeed, not only a non-Jewish criminal, but in this case, a Jewish criminal. In other words, there's already as well a sense that a gun or a sword, as we will see later on, is an implement of self-protection, but it is also a dangerous frame for misuse and abuse. And so we wouldn't want there to be a dangerous implement inside a home where people want to live comfortably and freely and without angst. So this frame is about how guns purport to be a resource for security, but actually they are like a shaky ladder. They are like having a bear it's having a bad dog. Owning a dangerous dog is against halachic norm. Please.
All of these examples and discussions, I think, seem to be focused on the utilitarian aspect. About
Yes.
whether or not guns promote violence, keep you safe, don't keep you safe. Maybe
Correct.
you could read into that some moral issue about for violence or not violence. In the United States, at least, my perception is that some segment of the gun community is talking on a totally different level. That they're talking about the question of individual autonomy versus the state, which is that there's this libertarian notion that the state can't regulate how I determine to keep myself safe, whether I'm right or wrong.
Right.
Whether the utilitarian benefit is true or not doesn't matter. This is a question of personal dignity or personal security, and the state shouldn't interfere with what I'm doing.
But they're probably
So it's a different
Correct.
different level of discussion.
Well, yes, except that what I would say, I totally agree with you, except that part of what I want to understand is the Second Amendment already guarantees the right to own a weapon for self-defense. The questions I want to get at is how can we engage a discourse and understand the motives by which people not only accept the right to own a weapon, but demand that right include high-capacity magazines and semi-automatic weapons. How does that demand for self-protection include non-registration of guns? I have to register my car because it can do damage. Well, not registering a gun that is actually built to do damage makes actually very little sense. In other words, all the frames around gun control are around limiting the negative side and the dangerous sides, and so if the NRA community is not willing to create reasonable frames around gun ownership, I want to understand why. I want to get at the guts of what is it inside of their discourse that we can identify with or not identify with. And in order to do that, my approach is to actually explore Jewish text. It might not be the most effective course for coming up with policy, but until Jews understand where are we around this, that we actually support the ability of an individual to own a gun to defend his family. We are just skeptical. We are skeptical around the effectiveness of that policy. In other words, our tradition is skeptical around guns being a reliable source of security. Two, I think that there's what to say around this movement in America, this pressure in America toward a kind of fascination with, if not love of guns. And so I want to address one last text that is really clear about how guns are not beautiful. And then I want to open up the conversation. Yeah.
The NRA may espouse a Bill of Rights platform to defend owning guns, but the people who actually are so set on owning guns fantasize that there are bands of roving gun gangs that are going to attack their house, and there are going to be 6 or 7 of them, so they need a large clip, and they have to protect themselves. It's not a
Right.
a rational issue. It's an emotional issue. It's existential. They're fighting for their lives.
Right. So I just want to say the reason that that's an important point to engage, but I want to engage the Jewish discourse around this, is that on some level, that sensibility it almost generates a kind of partisan identity. Like people experience themselves the way Jews did in the middle of the war in the forest. They are experiencing their lives in America as if they are in the wild, wild west, and there are a lot of Indians out there. So what I want to understand is
It's the government, not
well, it's not only the government. In fact, the government is one, because they're fearful of the government actually taking away their weapons. I think that they have this sense of a dystopian universe that they're living in, that makes it the safest frame is to actually for everybody to own a weapon. And what I want to get at is what discourse enters into that. Like, where can we, as a community, have memory of that, I think, psychologically traumatized space? And can we, as Jews, enough identify with it to speak to it? That's my question. We may not. We may basically discover that what is holding Congress thrall is a madness. And I'm not exactly sure, as a social justice worker, as a Jew, how one engages with madness. It may be that the prophetic method of screaming and yelling and mobilizing our base and getting everybody to shift priorities toward life-centeredness is the way to go. It may be that a whole cadre of people who own guns need to be spoken to in new ways, who are not the crazies, but are somehow under the control or under the fear-mongering of the crazies. And on that, then, maybe we could move forward. So one text I want to deal with directly because I think it's just interesting, and that is the text in Babylonian Talmud 63b. The Mishnah says a man may not go out with a sword, with a bow, with a shield, with a lance, with a spear, and if he does not go out, if he does go out, he incurs a sin offering. Now this is on Shabbat. You're not allowed to go out dressed with a sword. Rebbe Eliezer says they are adornments. What does that mean? They're jewelry. And just like you can wear jewelry, I mean, you wear jewelry on Shabbat, we take it out of it. And, it's not clothing. But we're allowed to wear adornments on Shabbat. The sages maintain they are merely shameful. For it says, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. According to the sages, while a sword might be necessary in a moment of war, it is not beautiful. And according to Rebbe Eliezer, there's a sense of beauty, of masculine beauty in wearing a weapon. Now, I don't know if open carry is around that.
Not in New York,
No, but in Texas,
not just Texas.
right? But another, what do you mean by
Well,
that?
Florida, Arkansas.
Florida, Arkansas as well, that's right. But my point is that on some level, this is about a right, but it is also about a certain fascination and a certain sense of weapons actually being a kind of an element of beautiful comportment that identifies a person as a full, self-reliant, like not one of those Jews who doesn't know how to shoot a .22, but actually a Gavra. So Rebbe Eliezer is identifying with this position. What's marvelous, of course, is Chazal, the rabbis basically say, but think of the vision. What makes guns ugly? A messianic imagination makes guns ugly. The reality is, guns are useful, and sometimes in their usefulness, they may actually give us a sense of competence. But if we remember that Shabbat is about this messianic fantasy, at least on Shabbat, as my mother would say, feh. So that's the thing. I think that we, as Jews, many of us see a gun and say, Lo yisa goy goy charev, lo yimudu l'chamot. This is a killing machine, feh. Right? Even if we are we're willing to wear it and carry it in Israel, in places where it makes sense to preserve life, we are, and I think Israelis as well, have very little fascination around weapons. If there's something Jewish about not being impressed with weapons of violence, right? In fact, feeling nervous and uncomfortable around it, even when they're necessary.
Rabbi, isn't that what we should be teaching as Jews to other Jews and others? That there are circumstances where guns are appropriate, but they should be respected and feared and used appropriately, and you should be trained to use them if you have them, and not flaunt them.
Right. So, 100%. So what I want to understand fully is, okay, so when the JCPA puts out its position, and rabbis speak about this, right? How is that being received by the larger public? And are Jews getting behind national efforts to make this, to get this done? Because it seems like without a surge, and President Obama recently spoke about this, without a surge of public commitment to these issues, they won't get done. Yeah.
I think, first of all, I just want to point out what you said about the sword, that in the Sikh religion, the
Yes.
ceremonial sword is very much part of the costume of the Sikhs, and they carry it with them at all times. But about speaking to people about guns, Bill Clinton had it right. And I think Bill Clinton, I heard him say once, he said, I'm a hunter. I like to hunt. I believe in guns. I own a gun. He was talking to the gun lobby. He was talking indirectly to the NRA. He said, but I don't need an assault weapon, to kill a deer. And I think assault weapons have to be controlled. And I think that's the kind of argument that might make sense with the NRA. And the reason that we haven't done this very well is most Jews are not hunters.
Right.
What I'm saying is our Our approach to it is an intellectual approach. And for the NRA, the fact that they are passionately opposed to any kind of legislation
Yes.
is this concept of creeping socialism. You know what I mean? You let the government outlaw one kind of gun, they're gonna outlaw it all. And
right,
then
right, the
they're
slippery
gonna come
slope.
after us. I mean, it's very much a paranoid mentality.
Right.
And I remember during the school shootings, when the gun control people thought we had a chance at limiting gun possession, somebody from the NRA said, the only person that's gonna stop, a crazy guy with a gun
Is a-
coming into
is a good guy with a
school
gun.
is a guy with a gun inside the school,
Right.
protecting it. And it's an argument that has a certain kind of weird logic,
Right.
So, it's a.
And yet, of course, it ends up with the absurd dystopian reality
Yeah.
of every school in America, with
With armed guards.
with armed guards.
Well, that's what they like.
Well, so the thing that hasn't been mentioned and probably should be mentioned is that behind this is the gun lobby that is being fueled by the gun manufacturers, and that a piece of this, Tom Diaz speaks about this in great detail, is simply that the American community has not been, the American public has not been either are unaware to recognize it or they have not been informed that the policies of the NRA and their entire leadership are owned by the greed of the gun makers, whose profits soar when in order to protect yourself from other people who have guns, you need a gun, to the extent that an 8-year-old in a school, a gun was found in his locker, and they asked him, why does he have a gun? And he said, for protection. Yeah.
We've won the argument in public. 90% of people are for strict gun background checks. 90% of gun owners.
Yes.
About 85% of NRA members.
Yes.
And if we live in a democracy, that might mean something. But we can't get anything passed because, well, let's say part of the reason is people aren't energized to do something about it. But do you think the Jewish community is lagging
Yes.
the rest of the community?
Well, I just think that the Jewish community, the Jewish community is fearful of risking political capital on issues that it's not sure it can win. Now, I think that's changing, but it's why the Hispanic community is for immigration reform, and the Black community is for poverty, and the Jewish community is, we are not completely one-issue communities, but the question is, what, it's that Brager question, what are you going to spend? You can't harangue Congress for 10 things. I mean, the RAC does it consistently, the Reform, Action Council. So it does, but not necessarily effectively. Yeah.
I would like to pick up on what you said in a democracy, because I agree with everything you said, that this is an unprecedented issue in a democracy where close to 90% of the public
Right.
are in favor of not having automatic weapons and having registration. And, as you said, well over 80% of the NRA members, not the leadership, but the
Right.
members, would go along with this. So if this doesn't make it into the public space, with that type of backing, you can't think of another issue that has that kind of backing.
Correct.
That's a major fault of leadership of our leaders. Now, I know that they're afraid to go up against the NRA, but somebody has to show them, some group, I think Bloomberg wanted to put together a fund
Yes.
to help
He
people.
has. He has.
I don't know where that went.
No, they're advertising in states.
And the idea is if you can show people that you can win, like Lindsey Graham won by, trying to compromise, or,
Right.
let a Supreme Court person, let one of Obama's Supreme Court people through, and he still won. If you can show that you can go up against the NRA and win, they're a paper tiger with an 85% of the public disagree with them.
Right.
And it's a
It may-
huge lack of leadership, of course.
It may be that I mean, I hate to say this, but it may be that it's the sadly, it's the Obama administration that makes it hard to get traction, and I wonder if this is the case, and that maybe the next administration. I can imagine a Republican administration being able to put this through, and I wonder if
With that kind of, Congress people want only one thing, to be reelected.
to be reelected.
And if they sense that their constituency likes this issue, they'll do it. And they're just now afraid of the NRA, and as you point out, with their backing from the manufacturers. But the gun manufacturers are not that powerful. And the rest of the world is more powerful than the gun manufacturers, and it just has to get mobilized.
So I'm hoping that that's the case. But the reason that I kind of took this approach to kind of explore our own materials is to begin to understand the madness that is beneath the picture, because I kind of think that there is a way to construct a discourse with that, with the 85% of the NRA that has not yet been successfully accomplished. And so I'm searching for a way to communicate with that, and I'm wondering, and it may not be true. In other words, Jews are very peripheral to this debate in the country, actually. The question is, huh?
I don't think you're right.
You think Jews are central to the debate?
Not central, but I think that there are an awful lot of Jewish gun owners in this country. I know I'm a gun owner. I know lots of professionals that are also gun owners that are,
It's just a very small population, isn't
and
it?
supportive of
gun laws.
legislation that would restrict the use of assault weapons and magazine sizes and would force registration.
Right.
Along with changes
So-
in the law with regard to.
so it's interesting. Do you think that-
psychological problems.
Do you think that there'd be, an interesting leadership question is that, do you think there could be what would it look like for there to be are you a member of the NRA?
No.
So that's an interesting thing.
Absolutely.
Jews
Never
who
were
are
told.
gun owners, how many of them are members of the NRA?
I don't know any.
And so that's an interesting question. I do know some, but I have a cousin who is. But I wonder what it would take to mobilize. Actually, so that's, you understand. My aim here is to wonder what are the discourses missing, because the language used by the JCPA doesn't seem to be actually making all that much dent in the challenges.
In my view, from the Jewish perspective, what we have to do is go to our communities and get them energized. It's not something we can do organizationally. It has to be something we do through our synagogues, through our JCCs, through people we talk to, through our friends, and
So-
get them to talk to their congressmen and their non-Jewish friends about responsible gun ownership and responsible legislation in order to protect our children primarily
Right.
from the hazards of gun ownership.
Yes.
So I have a question. I'm sitting here and engaged in this conversation, coming very much from the place of a young mother, and I'm realizing we're talking about the Jewish response and the Jewish community response, but I'm actually wondering, especially because there is some political risk, right, in our alliances and by the Jewish community speaking out together, perhaps but each of us are also connected to a universal. Like, there are communities of mothers and of parents who want stricter gun control, and I, as a Jew, can use my text and my deeper understanding and my values to mobilize, right, like, if we talk about a community organizing model where it's not the Jewish community responding, it's I as a Jew mobilizing a community that I'm a part of towards change, what would that approach look like?
Well, there's a website that I think Bloomberg may have funded it, called Everytown.
Yeah.
That just it's relatively.
That's a new name for Mayors Against the Lethal
It's a new name for Mayors Against Gun Violence, and they are attempting to create, I think exactly as you say, a discourse around this that is a public discourse that is not dependent on institutions or organizations, but is just basically web-based, and it actually has I think the capacity to create real discourse, because right now it feels to me like the institutions yell at each other. You know, I mean, there really is. If you read the Jews for gun ownership or whatever it's called, they too sound prophetic. They sound like they're Jeremiah predicting the doom, with liberal Jews endangering our children. In other words, that prophetic language actually is not working to counter the misperception of the gun, the gun lobby or the people focused upon ownership as a kind of fundamental definition of security. I think that what's your name?
Rachel.
I think what Rachel suggests is probably right on, and that is that the local, this will be addressed locally, successfully over time, with the kind of grassroots shift in feeling around this issue. One of the things that has to be admitted is that this is really a result of the fracturing of a certain social contract in the country. Israelis own guns, and guns are highly regulated in Israel. They own guns against what they perceive to be a real threat. The discourse in America around owning guns is a feared threat, often actually a trumped up threat. The number of burglaries that occur actually in America is minuscule in relation to the fear around being attacked or being burgled by somebody who's coming to harm you. So part of what's going on, and it's sort of interesting, the prophet imagines that the messianic ages, each man sitting under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid, is that, and this is what I gained from my engagement with this, is that trumped up fears generated by a kind of fraying of the social fabric of the country are really actually significant contributors, and it's community organizing that has the capacity to weave it back together. Because if it's mothers talking to each other, if it's fathers who are gun owners talking to each other, weaving together relationships that get different communities talking to each other and recognizing that it's our relationships with each other that make us safe, not our guns. We can own them for various purposes, but it's really actually not our guns that make us safe. It's our neighborly concern for each other. I tell that, I'm going to finish with this and we can continue actually off camera, is that my mother and aunt are one of the 1,300 children in France who were saved during the war as the hidden children. There were some 10 different Christian families who risked their lives to save my mother and my aunt. They didn't do it with guns. When my mother and aunt were living with in one of the last apartments after the men had been taken, so the children were playing in the courtyard and they were hiding in the attic apartment. And the children went down to play in the courtyard because they got too lackadaisical. And the Nazis came in. I mean, my mother tells this story, and came into the courtyard, and a barber in the courtyard, as the kids were screaming "Maman, Maman," said, "Come to Papa." The concierge in the apartment brought sausage and wine and beer and cheese to the Nazis going from apartment to apartment looking for Jews, and brought them the food on the steps to the attic apartment, which they never remembered to check. On some level, it was the relationship of neighbors that made for whatever safety was possible. There will be moments when there will be strong men with guns who will defend us. But it is the fraying of the social contract in the country that's actually really responsible for this carnage. And perhaps, you're right, that the discourse is not only about policy. It could be about prophetic outrage, but we have to fully address the fraying of the social contract that is making people more afraid than they need to be, and therefore less sane about what can be done to use guns wisely and effectively and not turn them into dangerous ladders and bears in our houses. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanna throw a question up for consideration. You know, this is not necessarily my opinion, but it kept coming to me when you talked about the Jewish communal organizational failure to mobilize on this issue. And I think there may be two factors involved. One is that maybe the fear that mounting an obvious Jewish attack on guns is going to have negative political ramifications.
I mean, anti-Semitism, it'll create a resurgence of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's actually possible? Are people fearful of that? Yes. I think actually people are
More
fearful.
than that, on an individual psychological level, there's a kind of, Israel has Jews with guns, it's true. Gun ownership on a private level is not
Very
it's
common
not
in
easy in Israel. But the picture we have in our minds of, the young kibbutznik with the rifle or the Uzi, that Jews feeling their weakness get a terrific gratification from that. And I'm wondering if that doesn't enter
Well,
into
isn't
the
that,
equation.
this is where I was going, is that young people who feel their weakness turn to guns to prop it up. But that weakness is a feature of the fraying of the social contract.
But
And-
what it points to is what, I'm sorry,
Please.
Rachel, what Rachel said, that maybe our best approach to this is to ally ourselves with other organizations, with other initiatives, not necessarily, not specifically as Jews, not specifically.
Firstly, that's happening all over the country indeed. In places where Jews organizationally are mobilizing around this issue in the Reform community, increasingly in social justice communities around these issues, Jews are making alliances with many other organizations, religious and otherwise, and it is growing. I think that the sad reality is that it may be that it takes just more than one tragedy to address this question. The other piece that we didn't mention, I want to just put on the table, is that this has been a minority issue as well in a very different way than it has been a white issue. The white problem is the problem of mass killings. The problem of inner city gun death is a very different problem, right? The problem of suicide is a very different problem, right? So each of these problems, the mental health questions, the inner city violence questions, the questions of assault weapons and high capacity magazines, these are each different elements, and it's good that the JCPA has kind of pulled them together and attempted to put them all on the table, but they each address very different problems and need unique solutions. Two more points and then we'll finish.
I think there's an important thing to discuss. I agree, of course, with Rachel and everybody here that we need to create coalitions and ally ourselves and do those kinds of attempts at education. But I think we're dealing with an irrational thought. If you talk about the social fabric breaking down, there's this small portion of the society that's irrationally holding on to these guns and misplacing their understanding of what the Second Amendment means, of what every Jew with the 22 means, and misplacing time where they are. And being not well trained, I'm very well trained with a gun, and I'm very not confident to have a gun in my home. Like you said, is laying beside my bed, never. Even though I am better trained than most people that I know. And to fight that irrational thought, to be able to go and create this educational standards and some kind of push towards an understanding of what it means to take a life. I think it's a very Jewish thing and a theological thing to understand that we as human beings are not meant to take life.
Yes.
Okay? And to make that an understanding for people, that when you take a life, regardless of why or how, it's not good, and you are not supposed to do that. And
So after one uses a gun successfully in the defense of one's loved ones, which is the fantasy that doesn't occur quite so often, your claim is we should teach people to be, we should teach people the real emotions, human emotions at that moment, are not celebratory. And in other words, there's some sense of the image in America of being kind of like, Captain America, Batman, Superman, and coming to the rescue, and with a gun, right? And that firstly, it would be good to document how often does a person with a gun, a good person with a gun, actually really stop a bad person with a gun.
Well, very importantly, after Newtown, there's been 77 school shootings.
Right.
And 12 of those schools had armed guards, which did not prevent the shooting.
Which did not prevent the shooting,
That's just exact statistics. And there's many more of those. So it's not plausible, it's irrational.
So I thank you all for being part of the conversation. There's no question that we as a community need to figure out if our commitment to life, our commitment to the Tzelem Elohim of every human being is strong enough to motivate us to take on an issue that in the short term feels nervous to many Jews, either in terms of the political capital that we might have to spend or in terms of the anti-Semitism among some that it might generate. And trust, I think that is what Rachel suggests, that we work beyond the institutional frame in communal frames, community organizing frames, to get people to begin talking and acting together in ways that are really new. And I work in an area of social justice, largely in the gay and lesbian world and the Orthodox world. And what we've discovered is that parents who love their kids, Orthodox parents who love their kids, are the most potent voice in the community. Often it's parents that will be able to speak into this conversation in ways that cannot be, kind of easily resisted. And let's hope that the kinds of grassroots, every town, mom and dad commitment to the sanctity of life prevails, and the Jewish community can be part of that discourse, if not leading the way. Thank you for your time.
Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Did a good job with that one. Yeah.